The green beam sliced through Portland's night like a sniper's bullet from the heavens. For a few blinding seconds, it locked onto a Customs and Border Protection helicopter, its cockpit exploding in a flash of emerald light that threatened to turn a quiet neighborhood into a crash site. What drives someone to aim at the sky, knowing a pilot's blindness could send flaming debris raining over sleeping families? That question now haunts a nation already split between fear and defiance. Within hours, federal agents descended with precision. The FBI traced the signal, raided a modest apartment on the city's east side, and arrested 4 men, identified as Diogenes Albores Suchiapa, Andres Brian Lopez Labra, Benito Zamora Alvarez, and Hector Miranda Mendoza. All were reportedly in the United States illegally, according to the Department of Homeland Security. The operation was fast, deliberate, and unmistakably symbolic. A federal fist closing around a localized act of defiance. Attorney General Pam Bondi's directive, newly signed under President Donald Trump's administration, had set the tone, mobilizing the FBI, ATF, DEA, and U.S. Marshals to defend immigration and customs enforcement sites whenever and wherever they come under attack. For Trump's America, it was not just an arrest, it was a message. A line had been crossed, and Washington would now meet street-level provocation with military precision. The incident comes amid a record 12,840 laser strikes reported by the FAA in 2024, numbers that Reuters and BBC both call an aviation epidemic. The danger isn't theoretical. Even a half-second flash can blind a pilot and trigger disaster. The Federal Aviation Administration now treats such attacks as acts of potential terrorism, punishable by fines exceeding $30,000 and federal prison time. Across the world, similar patterns unfold. In eastern Ukraine, Russian drones have used low-intensity lasers to blind optics on Ukrainian aircraft. In the Persian Gulf, Israeli pilots have faced coordinated laser interference near Iranian surveillance posts. In the South China Sea, Defense News confirms, Chinese naval vessels have repeatedly targeted U.S. reconnaissance planes with military-grade beams. A new kind of warfare, silent, invisible, deniable, is spreading. Yet the Portland strike feels different. This wasn't state-sponsored aggression, it was homegrown chaos, a symptom of deeper fractures inside America. Local protests outside ICE facilities echo frustrations that have simmered for years. Distrust of authority, anger over immigration enforcement, and political polarization that blurs the line between dissent and sabotage. Experts warn the boundary between civil protest and national threat is vanishing. Former CIA analyst Olivia Monroe told BBC News that attacks like this, even if symbolic, signal how fragmented America's internal security landscape has become. The danger is no longer foreign, it's domestic, scattered, unpredictable. When the laser beam faded, it left no smoke, no crater, no burned out vehicles. Just a question suspended over the city. If even the sky can be weaponized, how long before America's invisible wars turn inward for good? Dawn broke over Portland under a strange calm. The same skies that had burned green hours earlier now glowed with cold silence, but the city's heartbeat was anything but steady. Across a dozen command centers, a new name appeared on federal dashboards: Operation Line in the Sky. It wasn't merely an investigation, it was a signal to every federal district that the era of restraint had ended. FBI Portland led the coordination, backed by ATF ICE Seattle and the U.S. Marshals. Within 24 hours, 4 suspects sat in custody, the laser device recovered, and an apartment sealed off as evidence. The swiftness stunned even local reporters. DW later called it a surgical strike wrapped in due process. Federal officials weren't improvising. They were executing a playbook honed over years of unrest since 2020, when similar incidents had turned protests into urban battlefields. Behind the scenes, intelligence units parsed digital chatter. The Guardian reported encrypted messages linking the Portland suspects to an anti-federal protest group that had clashed with ICE officers weeks earlier. Homeland Security analysts found traces of online coordination, but no foreign fingerprints. This was domestic, chaotic, and deeply political. Attorney General Bondi's office wasted no time. In a late-night press briefing, she declared, "The United States will defend its agents and its airspace with every tool available." Those words reverberated far beyond Oregon. Across states, federal agencies began reinforcing ICE sites, upgrading aerial surveillance, and arming field units with anti-laser visors and infrared shielding. A quiet modernization that Defense News described as the first domestic hardening campaign of the decade. Strategically, Washington's move was about deterrence. America's adversaries were watching. The FBI briefed that within hours of the arrest, Russian and Chinese state outlets had amplified the Portland story, painting it as evidence of internal U.S. instability. For Moscow and Beijing, every domestic flashpoint feeds a narrative of American decline. But for the Trump administration, it became the opposite, a test of authority, a demonstration that the federal government could still project power inward as decisively as it does abroad. Parallels soon emerged overseas. In Kyiv, Ukraine Security Service (SBU) announced arrests of several saboteurs accused of using laser-guided tools to target military aircraft. In Tehran, Al Jazeera reported on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's crackdown on civil unrest using optical interference devices. The language mirrored America's, suggesting that internal security now moves on the same global axis as military defense. Still, beneath the headlines, the human toll of Operation Line in the Sky lingered. Portland's immigrant community feared broad retaliation. ICE vans patrolled longer hours. Streets that once echoed with chants of protest now felt watched. "Security has replaced trust," wrote The Guardian in its editorial. The arrests had achieved what they intended: restore federal control. But control came at a price: the quiet erosion of civil faith in government restraint. In defending the nation's skies, had Washington also darkened the horizon of its democracy? The directive from Washington landed like a thunderclap. Within hours of the Portland arrests, President Donald Trump signed an executive authorization empowering the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, to deploy federal forces whenever and wherever ICE or DHS installations came under threat. The move, confirmed by Reuters and DW, marked a sharp pivot in federal policy, a transition from reactive policing to proactive militarization. At its core, the directive reframed domestic defense as national defense. For the first time since the early 2000s, local protests and street-level attacks were treated as potential acts of internal warfare. The enemy no longer wears a foreign flag, one senior Pentagon source told Defense News. It hides behind constitutional rights and uses the streets as camouflage. Hegseth's strategy, approved by the National Security Council, involved the pre-positioning of tactical units near major urban centers, including Chicago, Seattle, and Los Angeles. The plan authorized rapid air deployment, drone surveillance, and even electronic countermeasure systems to protect federal airspace. It was the kind of order that blurred the line between Homeland Security and martial law. Critics in Congress, including members from both parties, warned of federal overreach. BBC analysts noted that the Trump administration's rhetoric, defending liberty through strength, echoed language once reserved for overseas conflicts. This could redefine domestic security for a generation, said DW's Berlin correspondent, drawing comparisons to Germany's 1970s-era anti-terror crackdowns. But the calculus in Washington was clear: deterrence through dominance. After years of civil unrest, border conflicts, and cyber intrusions, the administration sought to send a global message. America was regaining control of its own territory. Al Jazeera's coverage highlighted the contrast between Trump's decisive tone and Europe's cautious diplomacy. Where the EU called for de-escalation and dialogue, Washington prepared its armored convoys. Analysts in Jane's Defense Weekly emphasized the technological dimension. DHS contracts revealed a fast-track procurement of laser detection and jamming systems, devices once limited to combat zones. Military-grade hardware was being refitted for domestic use. It's the weaponization of peace, one defense researcher wrote. A war toolkit applied to a democracy's nervous system. Globally, parallels began to surface. In Ukraine, the militarization of police units mirrored Washington's shift, civil authority adapting to hybrid threats. In Israel, where security forces faced Iranian-backed unrest, similar justifications were made: order at any cost. Even in the South China Sea, Beijing's use of internal security doctrine to justify aggression abroad hinted at a worldwide merging of war and governance. Still, behind the Stalin strategy, a quieter unease spread. Civil liberty groups filed emergency injunctions against the new directive, warning that federal troops in domestic operations eroded constitutional safeguards. Freedom erodes not in darkness, but under the floodlights of security, The Guardian wrote. Yet public opinion told a different story. Polls by Reuters/Ipsos showed over 60% of Americans supported stronger federal protection for border and law enforcement agents. The laser incident in Portland had become more than a case file. It was now a catalyst for a new era of federal posture, one in which the skies above America are patrolled not only for foreign intruders, but for signs of rebellion within. As drones hummed over quiet neighborhoods and armored vehicles idled near ICE compounds, one haunting question lingered. Can a democracy still call itself free if its defense looks increasingly like war? Portland became a fault line, where civic identity collided with federal muscle. As word of the arrest spread, so did fury. Outside the city's ICE facility, protesters returned with banners reading "Not Our War" and "Stop Federal Occupation." What began as small gatherings soon swelled into nightly standoffs between demonstrators and DHS tactical teams flown in under President Trump's new directive. Mayor Keith Wilson drew a red line of his own. "Portland is not a battlefield," he declared at a press conference, echoing a sentiment captured across liberal strongholds nationwide. City Hall refused federal assistance, arguing that militarization would only ignite deeper resentment. But as The Guardian noted, the refusal carried a bitter irony. The more the city resisted federal help, the more it attracted federal attention. FBI Director Kash Patel stood firm. "No one blinds a federal pilot and walks away," he told reporters, describing the attack as an assault on national security from within. To Washington, the case was no longer local. It was a symbolic test of state authority, one Portland could not win. On the ground, the divide was palpable. Local police found themselves wedged between protesters they once knew by name and federal agents demanding cooperation. DW's coverage described a war of jurisdictions, where two governments shared the same streets, but not the same mission. The tension evoked memories of the 2020 unrest, but with a sharper edge. This time, the federal presence was not defensive. It was assertive. Strategically, Portland's defiance created a national dilemma. How far should Washington go to assert federal control without appearing to wage war on its own citizens? BBC analysts drew parallels with France's handling of the 2024 urban riots, where centralized intervention crushed disorder but left deep social scars. The United States, they warned, risked the same trajectory. The international reaction was telling. Al Jazeera called it a city under occupation by its own flag. European outlets described images of armored vehicles outside American courthouses as a portrait of internal contradiction. Yet, from a security standpoint, Defense News reported that these deployments were working. Laser strike attempts across the Pacific Northwest dropped 70% within 3 months. The message was clear: deterrence through visibility. Still, peace came at a price. Residents of Portland spoke of fear, not of terrorists or rioters, but of the faceless presence above. Drones hovered silently over protest zones, scanning heat signatures and movement patterns. Local cafes whispered of eyes in the sky, a phrase once reserved for distant war zones like Gaza or Donetsk. Across the world, similar fault lines were emerging. In Israel, confrontations between national forces and local communities mirrored the same trust deficit. In China, the People's Armed Police justified crackdowns on internal dissent using identical language: stability through strength. The line separating democracy from authoritarianism grew thinner by the day. Portland was no longer just a city. It had become a mirror. One side reflected a government determined to defend itself at any cost. The other, a populace fearful that security had become indistinguishable from control. And as the standoff stretched into winter, a chilling question rose over America's cities. When every protest is seen as a threat and every act of protection as provocation, who truly owns the streets? The Portland arrests were only the beginning. Within weeks, reports of similar incidents began to surface nationwide. Laser strikes in Phoenix, targeted drone interference near Miami, and coordinated online chatter calling for direct action against federal facilities. The FBI called it a pattern, but inside Homeland Security, officials used another term, a low-grade insurgency. Across America, attacks on federal agents had nearly tripled since 2023. ICE patrols were ambushed, DEA convoys targeted, and FBI vehicles vandalized. Defense News described it as a silent war fought in parking lots, warehouses, and city streets. The perpetrators weren't foreign militants or organized militias. They were ordinary residents radicalized by years of political fragmentation and digital propaganda. This new battleground was invisible, decentralized, and dangerously unpredictable. Jane's Defense Weekly drew parallels to hybrid warfare tactics seen in Ukraine, where small, coordinated cells carried out psychological and digital strikes to undermine central authority. Except now, the battlefield was American soil. Federal agencies began adapting like combat units. ICE vehicles were fitted with armor plating and counter-drone sensors. The FBI rolled out tactical response teams equipped with signal jammers to thwart remote-triggered devices. What once looked like policing now resembled urban warfare. Yet the escalation carried a moral weight. Civil liberties groups warned of a creeping normalization of militarized justice. Every laser pointed at the sky becomes justification for another armored truck on the ground, said a human rights advocate interviewed by BBC. The sentiment resonated with millions who feared that America's institutions were losing their balance between safety and freedom. Meanwhile, the world watched closely. Russia's state-run media used the chaos to paint the US as unstable and divided. China's Global Times called it a sign that American democracy has turned its guns inward. But in Western capitals, officials viewed it differently. NATO strategists, speaking to DW, argued that the US response was a necessary evolution, the adaptation of open societies to asymmetric threats. On the international front, the same logic was unfolding. Ukraine's drone forces, facing persistent Russian interference, had begun hardening their domestic security networks. Israel, after a series of attacks on its intelligence personnel, introduced stricter surveillance laws. Even European democracies, once cautious of government overreach, were shifting toward total security models. In this new paradigm, America was not the exception. It was the prototype. A nation learning that enemies no longer cross borders, they grow inside them. Still, the human cost was unavoidable. Reports from Portland's immigrant districts told of fear and displacement. People avoided public gatherings, worried about raids, checkpoints, and mistaken identity. One cafe owner told The Guardian, "We don't know who's protecting us anymore, our city or our country." The war on federal agents had mutated into something broader, a war over America's soul. Could the same government sworn to defend liberty maintain its legitimacy if its shield turned inward too often? And as arrests climbed and silence replaced protest, another question began to echo in Washington's marble halls. If every act of resistance is branded as rebellion, what will be left of dissent itself? By spring 2025, the storm that began with one green beam had reshaped the conversation about freedom, force, and federal authority. Washington's message was unmistakable. Any attack on those defending the nation would meet an overwhelming response. But beneath the steel uncertainty, America itself trembled. At the Pentagon, the numbers told their own story. Laser strikes down 68% nationwide, according to Defense News. Yet public trust in federal agencies had fallen to its lowest point in a decade, Reuters reported. The balance between deterrence and democracy hung on a knife's edge. President Donald Trump defended his strategy as law and order through strength, emphasizing that safety must precede liberty. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem echoed the sentiment, calling the crackdown a necessary evolution in an age of hybrid warfare. And in truth, the data supported part of their case. Coordinated attacks on ICE and FBI facilities had dropped sharply, while interdictions of illegal drones and optical devices surged. From a tactical perspective, the campaign was a success, but strategy has a shadow. In Portland, federal drones still hover above protest sites long after the violence has subsided. Surveillance towers peer silently over the city's industrial east side. Civil rights organizations argue that the emergency measures have morphed into permanence, a security state by inertia, as The Guardian wrote. DW's Berlin analysis called it the American paradox: victory in protection, defeat in perception. Globally, the effects ripple outward. In Ukraine, the US military's domestic security approach is studied for lessons in civil defense. In Israel, a mirrored philosophy drives counter-protest crackdowns amid escalating tensions with Iran. In China, state media frames America's domestic militarization as proof that freedom requires control. Ironically, each side claims validation. Strategically, America's internal measures are now part of its geopolitical identity. NATO partners observe the shift with quiet unease, admiring the efficiency, fearing the precedent. As BBC analysts warn, the same systems built to defend liberty may one day define its limits. Yet, among citizens, the anxiety runs deeper than politics. In Portland, one mother told Al Jazeera she no longer lets her children play outdoors at night, afraid of helicopters and spotlights. A pilot with CBP admitted to The Guardian that he still sees green after images whenever he closes his eyes. "We won," he said softly, "but I'm not sure what we kept." The case that began with 4 names, Alborez Suchiapa, Lopez Labra, Zamora Alvarez, and Mendoza, has faded from headlines, but its shadow lingers in every drone patrol and every federal briefing. America stopped the lasers, yes, but it also illuminated a deeper truth. The hardest battle is not between government and protester, or law and chaos. It is between the instinct to protect and the courage to trust. And so, as the night sky above Portland grows quiet again, one question remains suspended in the dark. When the state must choose between safety and freedom, which light should it follow? The Portland laser attack that targeted a federal helicopter in 2024 sparked a chain reaction that reshaped America's approach to internal security under President Donald Trump. The arrests of 4 undocumented men led to Operation Line in the Sky, a coordinated federal response that evolved from a criminal case into a test of national authority. Trump's subsequent directive to militarize the protection of DHS and ICE facilities redefined domestic security as national defense, merging civilian policing with military precision. While laser strikes and attacks on federal officers declined, the cost was visible: eroded civil trust, deepened political divides, and international concern over America's new security posture. Analysts from Reuters, BBC, DW, Defense News, and The Guardian note that the US model, defending liberty through deterrence, now mirrors global shifts in Ukraine, Israel, and China, where internal control increasingly defines stability. In the end, the incident stands as both a victory and a warning. America can secure its skies, but every light cast in the name of safety risks dimming the very freedoms it seeks to protect.